Why do you think this has been the response to the fallout of Charlie Kirk?
Because if there's evil, there must be good. And they saw evil, not just in the act, but in the response to the act. It stirs something in you when you see something evil. It stirs something in you when you see something evil being celebrated. What I think Charlie Kirk was able to do was to pitch a vision to younger men that you could actually be quite a strong person and have a family life and kids. When you read, if someone didn't mention Charlie Kirk at your church on Sunday, don't go there again. I go, I'm not so sure of that. If someone didn't mention Jesus, I'd have a problem.
Hey there, and welcome to the Upside Down People podcast. I'm your host, Caleb, and I'm so glad that you've joined with us here today. Before we get into this conversation, if this is your first time joining, thanks so much for tuning in. If you're a regular friend of the show, well, welcome back. You know what to expect. For those who don't, this is a podcast where we have gospel-centered conversations with people who love Jesus and basically explore and hear some stories on how Christians engage within this current cultural moment. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe to our YouTube channels or follow us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Also, if you're wanting to support us, share it with your family and friends, as that is the best way that you can support what I'm doing over here. So with that said, I'm so excited for you guys to hear this conversation. So let's jump into it together. All right. Well, welcome back to the Upside Down People podcast, Steve. So good to be having a conversation with you here today. I'm so glad that you jumped on for our listeners and viewers. This is a last minute thing for yourself, but it's been in my mind for the past few weeks since the Charlie Kirk assassination. I've wanted to talk about it, but I've been so aware of the insane amounts of information there's been. And with that, it's not just information, it's opinions, it's conspiracies, it's just inflamed emotional responses. Wanting to talk about that, a very public event that's had such a profound, widespread impact globally, particularly in the USA, which is understandable because that's where he is from. But then also globally, and then also here in Australia. Why do you think, just to start off, why do you think it's had such a profound impact on so many different lives across generations?
That's a really good question. And I think as an observer of media and how it works, one of the things I'd want to say is that the initial comments in mainstream media in Australia were, well, we'd never heard of this guy. But my son had, and all his friends had, and everyone under a certain age had, because media has changed in how we use it, how we access it. And we say, well, that's America and this is Australia. But that doesn't work anymore. It's a global media world. And so the influencers who are influencing people in Australia are whoever's got the big numbers. A lot of them are American. And so what you're experiencing is this cut through across how media is imbibed by us and who people are listening to. So part of the issue for me at the start was the surprise among some in Australia. Well, no one's ever heard of Charlie Kirk here. And then realizing these people don't know how people take on media now. And so I had non-Christian friends and young people in Australia who all knew who Charlie Kirk was. But then I read in newspapers from major figures who said, I've never heard of this man. I go, well, you are a dinosaur because you're not operating in the same media space anymore. And it's not the future. You don't operate in the future. And so I think the big impact was that he had such cut through globally in new technology. And he was precisely the kind of personality that just gets pushed to the front. And that's changed everything. And that's not the only reason why he was influential, because you have to have something to back that up. But his reach was a Joe Rogan type of reach.
Yeah, yeah. And the other sort of fascinating thing in all of this is what has been exposed. On top of that is how social media algorithms have siloed what people see of him. So that's something I've seen is some people only saw his political content or his views or positions on parenthood or families or his Republican stance, and then other people only saw his Christian content. But it was like when all this stuff started unfolding, it was almost like heightened the debate between who he was as on top of what people were seeing of him. So the weird thing about social media is you're only sort of seeing an angle of who this person is. How have you seen that play out? And like, is it damaging or has it created conversation? What's your thoughts there?
Well, two things, I think. The first thing I'd say is you're right. My experience of younger people in Australia, especially Christian young people, was that they looked at his Christian stuff because he was always on campus. On campus, he started to be much more bold, I suppose, in speaking about the gospel. But if that was your algorithm and it pushed it in that direction, a lot of young people came up to me and said, I'd love to be able to be like that in the way I come across as a Christian. As much as politics is concerned, I agree with some of it, don't agree with all of it. It's an American system. But this is a man who's 31 who'd nuanced his views over a period of, 8 years. He packed a lot into 8 years. And I think of myself as a 31-year-old. What would I be like? So I look at his political stuff and I go, there's an American thing going on. But there's also on the gender stuff and some of those other issues and about family, those things resonated, especially with a lot of young men. So a few years ago, someone said that they went doing a vox pop and they stopped women in the street with a picture of Andrew Tate and said, what do you think of this man as a role model for your sons? And they went, terrible. And he said, well, who is the role model? And they couldn't come up with a name. Right. So there was an absence. So what I think Charlie Kirk was able to do was to pitch a vision to younger men that you could actually be quite a strong person and have a family life and kids. And so that algorithm gets pushed. Now, some of the stuff on, the Christian nationalism stuff, I don't think he was fully down that line. I think he was still an evolving character. But what you then get is people just watch snippets of things without watching context. So social media gives, because it gave him great thrust, but it takes away because you can watch 30-second gotcha moments without watching wider sections. And I think that everyone thinks they know who Charlie Kirk is from their perspective, and that he becomes therefore a person, a bit like a Marilyn Monroe. They're bigger than themselves. They're a projection of so many different things. All those major famous people who've had sort of shifting, who've shifted culture, are projections of something. But in the end, they go home to a family, or in his case, don't go home to a family. And that was the tragedy of it.
Right. And what would you say in terms of who he was? What was the projection that people were making of him?
Well, it's interesting. I was reading in the Sydney Morning Herald, he was a man full of hate, misogyny, sexist, and racist. And I go, that doesn't sound like anything I watched. And I would say I watched a lot of the longer form stuff to see what he was actually like well before it. So I knew who he was. And then I read other people saying he was very gracious and kind. And then he had a long conversation on a dating sort of podcast with 8 OnlyFans girls. Yeah. And that was that's a beautiful conversation. Yeah. And what I think more than anything was that whatever you think of him, even the political people in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, he was the person who was doing politics the way America has struggled to do politics, which is face-to-face, let's talk it out. Let us reason together. But we don't live in a reasonable time. And if I were 31 and I was sitting on a campus and there were people coming up to the microphone who were just F-bombing me every second word with T-shirts that said, I hate Charlie Kirk or I hate Stephen McAlpine. I'm sure there's a T-shirt out there that says it, but, I don't know how to take that. So I think he was able to civilize. There's a civilizing aspect of meeting face to face, you would think, right. But it's still it's hard to figure out how you can have modern discourse in the public square when we're so divided on the big issues.
Right. And just with that, what's been your observation of people's responses as opposed to the media's responses? You've mentioned you're reading in the Sydney Morning Herald how it was very biased towards hatred, eliciting hatred and anger, which even that in itself, I read something recently how gone is the adage of the print media that sex sells, and rather now to elicit responses, you need to tap into the emotion of anger or rage. So that's interesting. Is that's what you've read in the morning paper? But yeah, what's been your observation of people's responses and the media's response in comparison?
Well, I read a wide range of media. Perhaps the people who are coming to me, people come to me quietly and say, I really feel bad about it. I feel like it was an evil act. I was at a church recently on the Sunshine Coast preaching, and someone who's not a Christian, who's around my age, perhaps a few years younger, probably a few years younger, had come to the church with his daughter and wife, and he came up to talk about those issues because people realise there's something called evil in the world. And I think that's what it did. The responses you see on TikTok with people gleefully crowing about his death, that shocked people just as much as his death did, because people going, there are no limits to some people, and it's the same with the Luigi, the guy who killed the health fund manager in the United States, Luigi Mangione, I think his name is, and the way he was eulogized for killing someone, but that someone was almost like a cipher or an avatar for the thing that you hate. So the way the health system is in America, people say it's awful, and so when a health CEO gets killed, that's sticking it to the man, and then Charlie gets killed, and that's sticking it to the Republicans or the Christians or the right-wingers. So they become just objects who are avatars for something that you dislike. But further down the food chain, people were disturbed. I think the best public political statement about Charlie Kirk and what happened was by Bernie Sanders, who's quite a left-wing. He had a very sober statement about, this is terrible. We should be able to have discourse. He should not have died this way. That is not where we want our liberal democracy to go. And he spoke a lot of common sense. But I also think at 80, he's the past. Right. Politics is going to take a hotter, more divided line in the coming years. But so you see this battle in the mainstream media about Charlie's legacy, and then you go online onto the social media platforms and you see that even more polarized, I think. And it just looks like a battleground.
What's the, like, if you had to extrapolate it, what's the impact that has then on culture, on relationships, as we engage in life?
Well, I don't think it caused a rupture. It just exposed that it's there.
Right. What do you mean?
So when he got killed, and you suddenly realize where people stand on things, because everyone said their thing and sort of marked their patch about how they felt. So you're going to get an extreme on the hard left and the hard right, and then you're going to get grades. And then there was a whole bunch of people in the center trying to, this and that. And I think everyone's a social commentator these days, right? Right. So everyone wants to have a say about it. And I think that what we've seen more than anything is that this was an exposing event which showed up where we already are. What it did for churches or some of the young people I met was that they said, who's speaking up for us as young Christians coming into the future? Because we're going to be living in the world where, although we don't face the same enmity that Charlie Kirk did when he spoke on campuses, we're keeping our heads down because we know that being Christian in this setting at university isn't very popular, and no one backs us, and we can't say what we want to say publicly, but he did, and where to from here, in that sense. So I heard a lot of those statements by young people over the last few weeks. So the dust will settle, but it will be, as many commentators in America have said, one of the most seismic political assassinations in the US history. And I think it has caused or exposed the fault lines in the culture in the US and to a lesser extent across the West.
Right. I mean, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It is, it's something unwitnessed on that live stage, in my generation at least, where you're watching someone's life get taken for opinions and views that they're expressing. And I think maybe that's part of it as well, is that almost everyone saw some form of footage of it. So it brings it closer to home. It's not this like you're reading words or hearing it, but it's this reality that it's like, whoa, it's right here. This has happened.
Well, I've refused to watch the footage. I won't watch the footage of him getting killed. But it's 4K, right? So it's not JFK getting shot from a distance with a grainy camcorder,
right?
Which even then, if you watch the JFK assassination, it's pretty brutal and bloody as well.
Yeah.
But this is next level, and I think that's something that disturbs us when we see that. But at the same time, it's because we have seen so little of that around speech. We're shocked. And this is where a few years ago, Brendan O'Neill from Spiked talked about this, and then Niall Ferguson, who's the Scottish historian married to A.N. Hersey Ali, also speaks about this, that we have spent a decade being told that words are violence, or 2 decades, and words are violence, and every violent act and you are either an ally of us or you're opposed to us, and if you're opposed to us, that's violence, until actual violence occurs. And then we see, oh, wow, that's what ends up happening. So the language you have used to describe our enemies has so heightened that this seems to be the inevitable outcome. That if Charlie Kirk was a fascist, then the bullets that were used to kill him had the words fascist written on it, and we got to stop fascists. Does anyone think that Charlie Kirk was a fascist? Does anyone really think that when you think about what fascism is and historically has been? I don't see how you can say that. And it's the heightened language that has inevitably led to this. So there's hate speech. I think we've got to be very careful about how we patrol our speech. I don't think we want to shut it down. But speech that incites violence is a different matter.
Right. And where do you think, I mean, yeah, freedom of speech is one of the... I was having a conversation recently with John Anderson, and he is saying like the 4 pillars that hold up a society. One of them is freedom of religion. The other one's freedom of speech, and then freedom of consciousness as well. But what do you think, like where has this sort of stemmed from or come from, this idea that words are violence, that someone could really truly believe within their heart that this person is a fascist, so the only logical outcome is to take that person out for the betterment of society? I mean, it's crazy to think that, but it's stemmed from somewhere.
Well, it stemmed from a very hard left perspective that's gone through the universities and the academic life and intellectual pursuit. Herbert Marcuse, we are to not be tolerant of the intolerant. So he was saying, don't tolerate conservative right perspectives. We have to be intolerant of them until we get true tolerance. And I think, what does that even mean? And so in one sense, there's a category of people that don't deserve tolerance and don't deserve free speech. And we've seen that through the universities, that free speech doesn't come for free. Right? You've got to fight for free speech.
Yeah. And
every university that has run off or hounded out an academic for speaking and saying something that is contrary to the sort of, I guess, the more progressive framework of the university, has to put their hand up and say, we're part of the problem when it comes to free speech. So free speech costs, and it costs you to be the cost is that you have to listen to things you don't like. And part of the problem too was Charlie spoke at the Oxford Union earlier this year, and the very hard left head of the union debated him poorly, I think. But when he was shot, that Oxford Union leader was, full of glee. Let's go, he's saying, and rejoicing in his death. And this is a man he looked at face to face and debated 5 months ago. And often we say, if you could see your enemy face to face and talk with them, you wouldn't feel the same way about them. Those days are over, baby, because this whole issue of who my enemy is and how I'm supposed to respond to them, especially from the left, has sprung up from this permanent revolution idea that everyone to the right of me is problematic, and they've got to be silenced because they are getting in the way of a great progressive vision of where we're going as a future.
Right. And I think something I've noticed as well, particularly unfold, is you've seen almost the conservative right in America. I mean, there's been less riots. So that's been quite profound in terms of the contrary response to where you saw George Floyd and the BLM movement. But something that's fascinating is even what they accused the left of doing, they're doing now with advocating the cancellation of people for. I mean, however horrific the views are, but cancelling people for their views. And we saw that most recently with Jimmy Kimmel. Yeah. He's been reinstated, I believe, since. But that's something that was celebrated by Trump himself. So when you've got like the head of state, the head of the government, commander-in-chief sort of advocating for the cancellation, it's like it seems like it's just a mess when it comes to how do we move forward with dialogue and conversation and proper debate to actually progress in society. What's your thoughts? I'm sure you have a whole heap, but what's your thoughts with those?
Well, I think Trump was unwise. I think you let the market decide. If Jimmy Kimmel had 129,000 viewers before that and 7 million after that, but it'll go back down, all right, because he becomes almost the avatar for that perspective. Yeah. The problem is that on the hard right, what the hard right is doing is saying it's looking at the hard left and going, we'll take the weapons that you use when we get power and we'll use them against you. So anyone who's a true liberal in one sense is struggling because they don't know how to engage with people who would actually cancel or wipe out the other. And the whole liberal project is struggling because it's come adrift from its historical Christian framework. So, the founders of the Constitution in the US said that this Constitution can only work for a moral, religious people. And so that's come adrift from a religious people in the sense of who God is, how we view other human beings made in his image, all those sorts of things. And so what you're getting in America is you're getting, as Ross Douthat said, the left could never imagine that the right might win ascendancy again and use the weapons that the left had used against the right against it. And now that's what's happening. They've sort of broken into the strong man's house, broke open his gun cabinet, and now they've got the weapons. And so you're going to get this tit for tat stuff depending on who's got power. And so it feels like it's going to be a long time before things start to settle down, even if they do settle down. Now, America's been through worse before. Let's face it, it had a civil war. It might head there again.
I mean, yeah, it seems like it's on a knife's edge with what could happen. If you had to make a prediction in terms of this event, let's just look at America to start off with. But do you think it's woken people up to just the fracturedness of culture in terms of what you're talking about earlier? If someone disagrees with you, opinion is or words are violence. So you have to respond in the appropriate manner. Do you think this has exposed what evil is and sort of separated the two? Or do you think it's like it is just going to pass over and society returns to its tit for tat approach?
A bit of both, I think. That'll happen as the shockwaves settle and you'll get back to normal duties because people hold to those positions religiously, ironically. It's the new religion. It did show up the face of evil, though. And, many people in America are mainstream middle people and they aren't all hardcore left or hardcore right. And many people who voted for Trump are not fascists. But the left has constantly said, if you did vote for Trump, you must be a fascist. And I think part of the problem has been if you paint someone into a corner, if you paint someone into a corner who says, look, I think marriage is between a man and a woman. Oh, you're a homophobic bigot. No, I'm not. I just believe that if you paint someone into a corner, eventually they'll go, well, I've got nothing to lose. I'm not going to try and agree with you anymore because you're not going to agree with me. One of the things the left has done that the right hasn't done is that the left gave up listening to it will cancel you. People said that they were cancelled by friends on the basis of events like this if they showed a bit of support for Charlie Kirk, or they were cancelled over their view of marriage by people who disagreed with them.
Right.
But conservatives tended to maintain their relationships in a way that people on the progressive wing didn't maintain relationships with people they disagreed with. That's been a tendency that many former progressives have said, as they've shifted to conservatism, that their experience was if they shifted to a conservative position, their progressive friends cut them. But when they were progressives, their conservative friends didn't cut them. And Bill Maher said people on the right always talk to him, even though they disagree. Yet if he disagrees with someone to the left of him, they don't talk to him again. And I think there's something in that revolutionary leftist position that cannot cope with difference. And I don't know what it is.
Well, maybe you can try and tease that out a bit in terms of maybe there's a value that the right has that the left doesn't have, or vice versa. Do you think that there is a value there that the left doesn't have? And if so, what is the value that the right has that they would be more open to going on a platform with someone who's extremely different to them, like Bill Maher, and having a conversation?
Yeah, look, I obviously think that on a more conservative perspective, it's built upon a Judeo-Christian framework, which holds that you can love your enemies. Donald Trump, for all his conservative tendencies on some areas, says he doesn't. He hates his enemies. Then he's just sort of said maybe Erica can teach him to love them. But to even say it, But on the left, the position, it's definitely coming from clearly a more Marxist framework of of oppressor and oppressed. So you've got that dialectical thing going on, that the only two categories there are oppressor and oppressed. It's ironically very binary,
right,
for a philosophy that doesn't hold to binary in gender. It's very binary on there's an oppressor and there's an oppressed. There's a victim and there's a perpetrator. There's the poor and there's the rich. And it's just very black and white. And so what you can't do when it's very black and white is be fraternizing with the enemy. But if things are more spectrum, and I think the right understand spectrum, the conservatives understand spectrum a bit more, then everyone's grading on a curve at some level. But the foundational understanding of the hard left position is that it's very binary and it's dialectical and it's these two polar opposites.
Right. I was listening to, I think it might have even been an audiobook by Gavin Ortland on The Art of Disagreement, I think it was called. And something he said, like a line that he said that I was like, oh, that's really helpful. So he was talking about how curiosity is really important in being able to disagree with someone. And he talks about how C.S. Lewis almost with his Inklings, he enjoyed disagreeing to where it was appropriate, but he would try and extend the disagreement so that that's the way of learning and progressing. And then I think his comment, C.S. Lewis's comment was, if we just agree on everything, it's quite boring and we're not really thinking. But Gavin Ortlund, his line was, if you give people, like, people are very smart and they, like, insanely intellectual people come to, like, crazily different conclusions. So that, if you're just looking at that, you have to be able to allow for some curiosity and understanding of, like, how did you come to that conclusion? But it's also it's dignifying the person for being able to think. And I think maybe I'd love to get your thoughts, but maybe that's also a value that the left has missed and the right has, where there's this inherent dignity given to a person, where you see we're made in the image of God, we're able to think, whether or not our thinking's right or, like, skewed and wrong, it's still the ability to process and come to a conclusion, which, if you're holding that, then you have to give someone space to talk and listen to them so that you can respond, and back and forth it goes, right?
Yeah, and the old left wasn't like that, as in, like, the old Labor Party in the UK or in Australia. So, example, Joe De Bruyn is a trade union official in Australia, and he spoke at the Australian Catholic University last year and gave the commencement address to the great and the good of the graduates at the Australian Catholic University. And he spoke about abortion, as in he's pro-life, he's anti-abortion. And 3/4 of the students during the speech by the valedictorian, the man, a distinguished guest giving the speech, got up and walked out. And the Vice-Chancellor apologised later to the students, not to Joe De Bruyn. And therein lies the problem, that if you can't sit in a place and hear something you disagree with without trying to shut it down, you're not formed for the world that you have to live in. And so if you have a couple of generations of young people who've been gentle parented and then been cosseted at university, and then they go to the real world, no wonder things fly around the room when they're told your ideas aren't the only ideas and they may not be the best ideas. And I think that's part of the problem. We haven't imbibed of the art of being able to disagree well from a young age. We've done everything we can to placate our children, to make sure that the teen is happy, that they've got their phone, that we don't restrict them, that we negotiate everything with them. And then you get to university and the lecturer's a bit worried about they might get reported for being bullies. And so you get this whole build-up, and then you get what I call cry bullies. They'll throw stuff around the room and say that they're the victim. And you go, well, that seems a bit odd. And so, but I think that the biblical framework of humans made in the image of God, having value, dignity, and worth, because it's built into the Christian framework, the Judeo-Christian framework, and because so much of the left in the last 100 years has been antithetical to Christianity, that's come adrift. And I think conservatism, when it's done well, has got the bedrock of that. Now, the hard right of it won't have, and you'll see the hard right and the hard left meeting in the middle, especially around issues of anti-Semitism. And so what you're getting is this, Ross Douthat said in the New York Times, if you don't like the Christian right, far right, wait till you meet the non-Christian far right, which is what's coming, right? And Ross Douthat picks these things really well as a conservative Catholic commentator in the New York Times. He just said, we are not able to have the kind of conversations that we used to be able to have. And unless we've got a common understanding of humanity, we won't be able to have those. Right.
What's your thoughts then on, like, moving forward and being able to cultivate a culture where you can have conversations and dialogue? Does that mean continuing to go onto campuses and have the prove me wrong conversations? Does that mean for the uni student engaging in their lecture having courage to say where their views differ and knowing that all the eyes in the class will be on them, and potentially they'll feel like a fool because no one else in that classroom thinks the same way. What does that look like to move forward?
Oh, it's going to take a lot. And it may be that it can't happen. I don't know. To be honest, I think the jury's out as to whether you can rescue those institutions again and have deep, real conversation. And you're seeing it in that other people are trying to set up new institutions where those things can happen. Now, one of the champions, I think, for me, who's the best example of a conservative centrist, I suppose, is Bari Weiss from the Free Press. And she has lots of different voices in her space and her Honestly podcast. But people like Josh Zepps, who's a great Australian, and he's, a bit more progressive than most, but he's a liberal in the right sense of the word, in the political idea. And he's a gay man with, he's married and with kids, so he's not sitting in the space that traditional conservatives would sit in, but he sees the need for some conversation to happen and happen well. But he too laments that we may not be there. And so I wonder going forward, it's not that you get up in the class and feel like a fool. It's that you get up in the class and you are considered evil.
Right.
That's different. And then that becomes, if I associate with someone who's evil, that rubs off on me. I'm evil. So what you get is you're not just considered a bit of an idiot in class and everyone will pat you on the head and buy you a round of beer and feel sorry for you. They'll isolate from you. You will be isolated, and that's a huge issue.
Yeah, that is a terrible issue, and I really feel for people going through that. But it almost seems like you're sort of at this headway where you have to make a decision, or you need to make a decision for your own sanity, whether or not to either push in or to it's like a form of escapism. I can't even say the word.
Escapism.
Because you're just too unwilling to engage in it. So then you end up being in a place where you're not known and you feel like you are in this act that you don't want to be in, which I sincerely empathize with people in that situation. But it's hard because it's like, well, will it be easier if you just take a stand and commit to your views, or will it be harder? I don't know.
The answer is yes to both of those. It will be harder in the short term and it will be easier in the long term, and you may not necessarily live to see that. And that's the thing. Can people make a decision that's principled and put their neck on the line? Now, I'm going to give you an example of someone who did and is worth reading, who's not a Christian, who wasn't a Christian at all. He was an atheist. Václav Havel, the poet dissident from Czechoslovakia, and who rose after the fall of communism to be the president of the Czech Republic. And he's a great man. Now, I went to Prague in the Czech Republic. It was still Czechoslovakia then, just after the fall of the Berlin Wall, so during the fall of communism. And I went to stay with a Brethren family in their church and their house. And they had a huge picture of Václav Havel on the wall. And I said, oh, that's interesting, because they're very conservative. You've got a picture, I didn't put it this way, you've got a picture of a chain-smoking, womanizing, atheist president on your wall. What gives? And they said, because he gave us our freedom.
Wow.
He allowed us to be who we are. And, Václav Havel didn't come up with that when he was president. He came up with that while he's languishing in a prison, because he fought for that all his life. And he paid for it with his freedom. And he's written a great essay called The Power of the Powerless. And it is exceptional in how it unpacks the way we fall into line, even though we don't believe what we're falling into line for. And even though we know our neighbours don't believe it either, they fall into line. And so this plausibility structure sits over us, that no one breaks rank. No one goes, the emperor has no clothes, because we're too scared. And we think, if I say it, everyone agrees with me, but they'll agree with me privately. I'll get, and I found this whenever I've said something online that I think this needs to be said, I get shredded publicly by people who don't like what I say, but I get praised privately. And that's the way we operate.
That is fascinating. Yeah. Yeah. I read one of your posts probably a few weeks ago or a week ago in the unfolding mass of when you're giving your thoughts and your opinions that that you're getting, was it emails like with death threats almost?
Just a few death threats. Not a lot, but you know.
That's crazy, Stephen. So like even was it from here within Australia?
It's probably from the US.
Right. That
they just send them through on my website, and I go, but I go, do people actually think that they just don't think through these things? And it is kind of bizarre. But I think that's because no one wants a fight. Well, some people want to fight, but everyone says, can't we just move on and get on with things? And there are people that are going to say no to that. And so occasionally you need to go to the wall. And I think someone like Václav Havel is one of my heroes because that's what he was able to do, not from a Christian perspective, but because his deep commitment to the freedom of his fellow human beings to express themselves honestly in how they felt about things and to live a life that reflected who they were. So I'd be very cautious that we don't get a swing either way, hard right, hard left. But I do think that the Christian framework gives us a lot of, a lot of territory to operate with that's those who are post-Christian don't have.
Right. I'm gonna ask it. It's sort of like jumping back into the impact that the Charlie Kirk situation has had on young people. It's just wanting to get your thoughts on people returning to church or wanting to go to a religious gathering, particularly like a Christian church. I've spoken to a number of pastors and people within churches here in Australia, and then my friends over in the States as well, and hearing stories consistently of non-Christians just messaging them saying like, hey, can I come to church with you? When's the service times? Just this crazy interest in wanting to go to church. Why do you think this has been the response to the fallout of Charlie Kirk?
Because if there's evil, there must be good. And they saw evil, not just in the act, but in the response to the act. And it stirs something in you when you see something evil. It stirs something in you when you see something evil being celebrated. And so it stirred people's conscience. It also means that they did watch Charlie as someone who was a public Christian. So they recognized that. But I do think it stirred something in people that life is short. There is such a thing as evil. What am I going to do about it? And it is anecdotal, but everywhere I went, people were saying, we had people turn up to church because of the Charlie Kirk thing. Or we had people out of the blue come to church. And I was on the Sunshine Coast the other week. I was attending a Wes Huff event. He was in the East Coast. And the church that it was run at, the pastor said 20 people, younger men, or probably 40 age group, around his age, who he hadn't seen in a church for 20 years, phoned him and said, we want to come to this event. Off the back of what had happened. And so I think it raised the question of evil and ramped that question up. If there is evil, surely there must be something good. Now, that hasn't all come out of nothing. There's been a build-up of the quiet revival that was spoken about in the British setting. You're seeing a return of young men to church in a trickle in the last 5 years post-COVID, but we are in a seismic moment. And I think the COVID Black Swan event was also exposing of who we are and where we're struggling. And then event after event since then has just ramped that up. So I think this was a tipping point event for many people and gave them permission to say, I want to go and explore what this is about. And I think we don't predict those events at one level because we're going, well, there'll be a trickle back to Jesus, maybe. But suddenly a black swan event just booms that up. And this was a black swan event. It was something we didn't see coming, and it changed the nature of the discourse, and it fast-tracked the response to Christianity, I think.
Do you think, do you think they'll find what they're looking for in churches?
Some will, some won't, right? What are they looking for? When you read, if someone didn't mention Charlie Kirk at your church on Sunday, don't go there again. I go, I'm not so sure of that. If someone didn't mention Jesus, I'd have a problem.
Man. Yeah, I'd love to get your thoughts on that, because that was another thing as well. The amount of influencers and pastors particularly that had those sort of statements, those binary, if you don't do this, then you need to leave your job and retire as a pastor. Like really hostile.
Well, that's just...
Yeah.
Well, that's just taking the weapons from the other side and using them, like I said before. It's doing the same thing in the opposite direction. So what you want to say is, if you didn't preach Christ and the brevity of life and the uncertainty of your future and the need to repent in the same way that, Charlie Kirk had said, you don't have to use his name. There's nothing wrong with saying his name. Everyone, if you use George Floyd's name, you probably should use Charlie Kirk's name, right? If you didn't, you don't have to. Well, I'm not saying there's no hard and fast rule. But if people come to church because they want you to say the thing they want to hear, you have to tell them the gospel. Now, at the same time, I think evangelical churches have struggled to know how to navigate the political sphere. And I think that's part of the problem. But I don't want people coming just so that they can have a more conservative, pragmatic understanding of how to live their lives. I want them to come and hear about Christ.
Yeah.
But then I think that's what Charlie would have said as well. When I listened to him, when someone said, if I had 30 seconds left to live, what do you want to tell me?
Yeah.
And he said, you're going to face the judge of all the earth. You're going to be judged according to how you have responded to his son, or Jesus himself. You need to repent and trust in Jesus for your salvation. There's your 30 seconds. But most evangelicals don't know how to articulate that in a way that they think that sounds twee. I think we've become too sophisticated. If you've got 30 seconds to leave, what am I going to say to you? I'm going to say, there's the imminent frame and there's the social imaginary and there's, it's like, get to the point. And so lots of young people we're coming to church because they go, what's the point of this? Right. And that's where you get to tell them about Jesus. Yeah. You don't get to tell them about Charlie. Charlie would have said, point them to Jesus, not point them to Charlie, I would have hoped.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's the core of it as well, and the hope that people who have been searching and this sort of incline them to go and find answers and try and find the truth. You wouldn't want to get a replay of like your social media algorithms now played out in church. You'd want to get the gospel of, who Jesus is, what he's done, and what he's given for us to enjoy eternal life with him. But the crazy thing is so many churches have and people have responded in a way which it feels like it's just heightening that social media algorithm, just like, hey, come listen to what our thoughts are of Charlie, instead of like, horrible situation. What does Jesus have to say about it, and pointing people to Jesus. And the other thing I've noticed, and I'd love to get your thoughts as well, is how people have used this situation to chase clout. I don't know if you've witnessed that online, but maybe it's just my social media algorithms, but it's just crazy to see it, like how many people. And that's also why I was like hesitant of having a conversation, because I'm like, this is just off-putting of what the gospel is, of a terrible situation. So all these different things. And it's just like, are people getting they're using this situation to increase their platform, to increase their their likes or their views off their expense of like a devastating situation. Have you noticed that?
Yeah, rage bait. If you want clicks, that's what you're going to do. I'm very cautious of that. Obviously, I write about everything all of the time. Someone said, I'm done with you because you were too conservative on this issue. But I said, I've written 5 pieces about Christian nationalism in the last 2 years. At least everyone's hating on me. But that's not church, right? So here's the good thing about having a liturgical framework at church. Every Sunday at church in Sydney, there's a corporate prayer, pastoral prayer by someone, right? And we pray about the nation, the state of the world. We pray for our governments. And there's a perfect place when you're talking about Ukraine or the Middle East or praying for Prime Minister Albanese or world events to say, and we pray for the situation in America regarding Charlie Kirk. We pray for his widow. We pray for... You've got an opportunity to do it in your prayers if you've got a prayer system in your church which actually prays about things that are going on in the world, which it should. And I think liturgy actually gives you a safety net that you don't have to say everything, but you can say something at some stage in your prayers, or it can be mentioned in your sermon. It's not like it can't be, but liturgy gives you a place to deal with world events because the prayers of the church actually every week, you're not just picking up a world event because Charlie Kirk got killed. You're picking up world events every week because you're praying to the God who created the world about the world. And I think that's something that we could do more often, and it might raise the question in churches, how do we deal with anything like this if we're not praying about it already?
Yeah, very good. I think that's brilliant. That's something I've appreciated at the church I'm at as well, is just that set in stone practice of these are the things we're going to be praying for each week. And yeah, you're right. It does actually give an opportunity to put your trust in God, put your despair or your hope or like whatever emotions you have, and take them to the right place. Not online, but to our Creator God, which is the right place to do it.
Yes.
What do you think this means for Australia and for Christians here? So bringing it home to our country particularly, because it has impacted, like you said, young people here. It's had a profound impact. But yeah, what does this mean for Australia and for Christians?
Couple of things. We're not America, but we live in the shadow of it. And social media has flattened and fast-tracked the way we receive information. So what we're seeing is there's a 2-tier system in Australia, just as there is in America, between those who don't live in a social media world and those who do. And so young Christian people who do live in a social media world are being told constantly, get off social media. But it is their world. It's not like if you're not a digital native, then their world of social media seems weird to you. But it isn't to them. It's how they live. We're living in Sydney and my son's been doing school online with his old school in Perth, but he's in constant contact with his friends in Perth. And so when you come back to Perth, it's just picking up where he left off because of how you do life online. And so I think it showed that there's a divide between the older generations and the younger generations. It's also shown that there's a divide in Australia, as in America, between people's extremes of political views. I think would be naive to say that. It's shown that there's a globalized progressive framework and there's a globalized conservative framework. And even though it's dialed down at one level in Australia, it's still here. And it's across all the West. It's not just about Australia. Local conditions shape it a little bit, but it is going to become more ubiquitous and uniform across the West the more we go into a digital world. And also the digital world will start to manipulate that through AI and all the things that we're seeing with technologies coming down the track. So I think we're in for a rocky couple of decades, unless a zombie apocalypse happens and we have no technology left. Might be easier.
Right. Yeah. Well, the rapture was supposed to happen when on the 23rd or
I know.
24th of September.
That's right.
So with all of that, how should Christians respond to the rocky outlook that's ahead?
Well, you think of Psalm 2, is it Psalm 2 or Psalm 8? Psalm 2. Why are the nations raging and seething and against the Lord and his anointed one? And the way that the early Christians in Acts quoted those Psalms about the struggles of the world. So one of the things you want to do as a Christian is you want to see that there's an apocalyptic issue going on here. There's something going on behind this, and it's the evil in the world. It's the powers of this age that would desire our destruction. So the first thing you've got to do is put on your spiritual glasses as a Christian and look at the way we're operating in the world. The second thing you want to do is say, we're going to do what Christians have done for 2,000 years, and it's bring it before God and say, we have a God who made the worst situation in history ever to be the best outcome ever. The cross was the worst thing that ever happened in history, yet it's the salvation of the world. And so you want to have confidence in that, because one of the things we need to realize is that most people who don't have a Christian framework don't know where history is headed. And we do. So that helps us dial down our anxiety. And if we do dial down our anxiety, it also means that we dial down our hostility towards people who disagree with us, or our fear of them, or our hatred of them, or whatever it is. And I think Christians can live in a much less anxious way. Now, that doesn't mean to say we retreat to quietism and we don't get involved in the political agenda. I think you can still do that. Law, politics, the arts, we must be involved in those things. But it dials down the anxiety level, and it dials down the win at all costs level, because in the end, we have won in Christ. The victory is his. One day, everyone will bow the knee before Jesus and confess him as Lord. And that's our big vision that should drive us today.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's brilliant. I just looked it up. It is Psalm 2. Why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? Yeah. Brilliant perspective in that. I think Mark Sayers wrote a book called The Non-Anxious Presence.
It's one of my go-to books, to be honest. Because I think he nailed that issue. What does it mean to be a leader of people in an anxious age? And I think Christians can be very influential in the coming decades because they don't have to have anxiety in the same way that the culture has it. I think Mark Sayers was right about that. In fact, a lot of his thinking in the last 10 years, especially on his podcasts, seems to have come to fruition, I think.
Right.
And what he also says, we're living in a grey zone, and that's probably another thing that I agree with him on big time.
Do you want to expand on that a bit?
Yeah, he says we're living between two epochs, something shifting to a new way of thinking in our world from an old way, and we're going to take some stuff with us and we're going to leave some stuff behind. But we haven't decided what that is yet. What's the pivot going to look like? And so we're in this period of churn, and we see it globally. We see the rise of China. We see the events in the Middle East. We see US isolationism, as much as they're trying to be more isolated, that world events keep happening. And you're starting to see this churn and shift towards something else. And I don't think it's necessarily going to be a very happy place in the new epoch. I think AI, tyrannical government will be the future for the West, not for the West, for the world for a while.
Right. What, I've got really hopeful lenses, but that's just my disposition. So when I hear
have hopeful lenses, I'm just being realistic.
Maybe I've got ideal lenses. Yeah. So when you say something like that, it's obviously like, okay, how then should we prepare for an environment or a culture that is tyrannical? And yeah, what could we be doing now to guard our hearts, to prepare our souls, And then also not to isolate, because I think that's the fear, right? And is if you're anxious, you want to isolate, you want to create a little bubble of positivity or whatever that looks like, and you ignore the reality of the situation because you're either just wanting to be blinded to that. What's your thoughts there?
Well, I think the first thing you want to say is the church has got to be deep, rich, thick relational communities which provide meaning and solace and safe havens for people. And if that means that they are well-established church buildings with good networks and good outreach and a school that takes you from K to 13 and helps you, that's a good thing. So deep, thick relationships where people go, there's something here that feels like an outpost of a more hopeful life. At the same time, you're going to have to go into the world and work. And that, we have gone through a bit of a vibe shift against some of the woke stuff, but I still think that's going to play out for a long time. But the rise of China, the fall in the love of democracy among young people who say, why should we do it? Just give us peace and safety. And the Chinese model gives peace and safety. My twin brother was in Beijing the other week and said it's the most amazing city he's ever been to. Safe, clean, quiet, futuristic. I said, yeah, but tyranny. He goes, yeah, I know. He's sort of conceding that. But when China invades Taiwan, that'll be your next event. And that's going to happen. That's not going to happen. That is going to happen. And so in some senses, in the early part of the 20th century, people in the West thought that they were way too modern to slaughter each other in the fields of Flanders. Yet they did.
Right.
And then they went for another round 20 years later. Right. So the height of modernity in its mind led to those two things. We're probably due another big war. The dots just haven't joined up yet, but I think they will. And I think that's where the world is going. It's going to go to that stage, I think. How we dial back from that, I'm not sure. But that's what Jesus said in his, mini apocalypse in Matthew's gospel. You're going to hear of wars and rumors of wars, but do not be afraid. Now, I heard a podcast from a great liberal, as in politically liberal, gay atheist who wrote a book. I can't even remember the title of it. The podcast was great. And he said, I used to think that the future of America would be less religious if it was going to stay safe. And I think it's actually Christianity is the future of America to keep it safe. He said, I never thought I'd say that. But he said, one of the key issues when I read the Bible to see what the Bible said about politics was that the term do not fear kept coming up. And he says, I think one of the things that's been the safety net in America is that God is above our politics, so we don't have to be afraid of other people or other ideas. He said, now that we've taken God out of our politics, I wonder if we're just going to become more afraid of each other. Right. I thought that was a very interesting observation by someone who's not a Christian. Yeah. And when he was asked by the also non-Christian interviewer, well, why haven't you become a Christian if it seems so right? He goes, it's just too challenging for me and I haven't approached that one yet.
Wow.
And I think I want Christianity to be more weird going forward in the right way, right?
Being the weird guys.
Being the weird guys, there's a follow-up, right?
That's it.
And somehow we have to be able, as Christians, to live lightly but also soberly in this current culture, right, and to do so with meaning and purpose and not withdrawal.
Right. And I think you're right. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but part of being a Christian is being made holy. And if you translate the word holy, it's not just, it's like being set apart, but in a way as well, it's being weird. It's different to what the cultural mainstream looks like. So it is something that's like we have a God who's alive and who calls us to live in a different way, to what maybe our innate desires are or things like that. So there should be this weirdness that's like different, but not hostile.
Mm. Yeah. See, the Bible doesn't tell me to put other people to death. It tells me to put my sin to death, right?
Very good.
Because John Owen, be killing sin or sin will be killing you. That sounds very piratey, doesn't it? It's a be killing sin. Yeah. But there's truth to that, isn't it? That the Bible gives you a level of self-awareness that humbles you about your sin and also makes you more realistic about what you can expect other people to be like. So you're not constantly enraged when they are like that,
right.
because that's what the Bible says they're going to be like. And I think Christians going forward can be weird in the way that people go, there's something different about them. They've got a hope beyond what other people have. They've got forgiveness beyond what other people have. And it's just going to be the long, hard haul to keep doing that. I don't want us to get into isolationism. I think many pastors don't understand the workaday week of their people, and they need to understand it a little better. We don't support our politicians who are Christian enough. We don't figure out how to do life in the public square very well. We don't know how to have clear, honest, hard conversations about big ethical issues without being afraid that we're going to get beaten down. Now, part of the problem is the messaging it's hard. The mainstream media will never message a pro-life movement as anything but restrictive to women or whatever. But I have noticed that the Orthodox churches and the Roman Catholic churches, the Marianites, are much more publicly square able. They're much more able in the public square to have deep difference with people who disagree with them because they've got a confidence about their church and who they are. And I think evangelicals have struggled with that.
Yeah, definitely. I want to ask if you think there's anything that would be of value to add to this conversation that we haven't spoken about or you haven't expressed. But while that's in the back of your mind, did you have a thought just then?
No. Okay. We'll keep it at the back of my mind, and it might come to the front as we have this conversation.
While that's in the back of your mind, and something I've also come across in all this turbulence is that there's a lot of demonic or spiritual forces behind what's at play. It's not something we've spoken about over here, but it is something I'm curious to see what your thoughts are with regards to that.
Why would we not think that the devil has a hand in many things? There's an invisible realm, and modern Western Christians have almost become embarrassed about saying that because it shows that we're not sensible. But I do think the Charlie Kirk thing showed up evil, not just as human beings have an evil to them in the way they behave, but there's something behind what have occurred, and there's something behind that glee in people that should horrify us, that there is something invisibly evil and there's an invisible realm. Now, Jesus is in control of the invisible realm, but it's still there. And there's a couple of good books on that. There's Michael Heiser's book, The Unseen Realm. There's Living with Wonder, which is Rod Dreher's latest book about some things are a bit wacky in that book, I think, but he's an amazing writer and thinker in this space. And I think evangelical Christians just have to realize that non-Christians are getting into all sorts of weird and wacky spiritual stuff and getting burnt by it.
Right.
Because when the gospel recedes from the culture, it hasn't been replaced by secularism. It's been replaced by superstition, by a return to paganism. And so you're seeing all sorts of weird and wacky spiritual stuff happening. So I think we need to take the unseen realm a little bit more seriously. And we haven't done that because we've been afraid of not being taken seriously ourselves by intellectuals.
Yeah.
But now people are starting to go, maybe there is something unseen and evil and malevolent in the world that we should flee from and flee towards safety somewhere. And for many people, that's Christ.
Yeah. Do you think I agree with what you're saying. I think that whole idea of intellectualism and that sort of stemmed from, just like postmodernism and like how your intellect is the essential. If you can't reason something else, then it doesn't exist and it's crazy. But do you think there's a space where you can say, like, I have no idea about these things, but clearly they're evident?
Yes, I think you can. And I think if you went to sub-Saharan Africa, you wouldn't think that the devil's greatest trick is to convince you that he doesn't exist. You would think that the devil's greatest trick is to convince you that he's more powerful than any other spiritual force. And when Jesus comes into places in sub-Saharan Africa, they don't all become modernists who say there's no spiritual world. They all become Christians who say Christ has broken the powers of evil in the unseen realm.
Yeah.
And so that's the difference that we need to get back to understanding that in the West. Because if the devil wants to destroy us by convincing us that he doesn't exist, he'll do that. If he wants to destroy us by convincing us that he's more powerful than anyone else, he'll do that. But neither of those positions are all that different. It's still the devil at work at that front. So we have to realize that there is an invisible realm. And one day the sky will get peeled back and the invisible realm will become visible. That's what we believe. That's what's apocalyptic about it.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. 100%. And I think it's so. The reason I wanted to ask as well is because I do think it's important, and I do think it's one of those things that when you start talking about it, you immediately sound weird, like we were saying before.
Yeah.
But it's essential. I think it's an essential understanding to have as a Christian, to realize there's demonic forces, there's spiritual forces at play. There's the war isn't just against flesh and blood, but the powers and principalities. So I think it's important to recognize that, and then also to be able to communicate it, because it gives understanding to, like, we're not, again, that non-anxious presence. It gives understanding to, this isn't like what we're seeing unfolding isn't Steve versus Caleb, us versus them. This is like Jesus Christ versus Satan. And we know the outcome of that. But to be able to then proclaim him as king, I think is important, because we need to, we need to be able to see that he is victorious, that he is a king who we can trust in and put our confidence in, which I think eliminates fear and brings in hope.
Yeah. Look, I don't want to second Jesus to my cause all the time. I've got to be careful about that as well.
Yeah.
Right. When it says, when the angel of the Lord meets, is it, Joshua, or are you on our side or our enemy's side? Neither. I'm the angel of the Lord.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't mean to say there isn't good and evil, and there are not good causes and bad causes. But it is to say that more is going on in the spiritual realm than we could even imagine, at levels beyond what we can imagine. And so we're not given insight into that. So our curiosity about it has to be sated by Jesus and what he says. That's not our realm. We don't know that. And so I think what we want to say is it's very real. Don't mess with it. It's a spiritual world. And most people today are post-secular. They're not post-Christian. They're moving into spiritual stuff where, a businessman can be wearing a suit to work in Sydney on Wednesday and going to a tarot card reading on Friday.
Right.
You've got this funny mix of modernity and sort of paganism at one and the same time. That's the world we live in.
Yeah. And I think it does give discernment as well to notice, okay, this is evil, like this is not of Christ, this is not of God.
Yeah.
Which is helpful.
Yeah, that showed people up. Yeah, and that's what I think. It was visceral to people who were not Christian, who decided they might go to church off the back of what happened to Charlie Kirk. It affected them because in their spirit, as much as anything, it disturbed them.
Yeah.
And I think that's a collective. When C.S. Lewis said it, he said it during the start of the Second World War, that God whispers in our pleasures and shouts in our pain. A pain is God's megaphone to rouse a deaf world. I think we had a collective pain in the past few weeks that roused a few people's spirits about what's going on in the world.
Yeah.
And I think that's what happened. As far as the Charlie thing, if you want me to just add into that, probably the Erica Kirk's comments about forgiveness will be a safety valve for some of the angry responses you might get.
Yeah.
And you saw a little break in her position versus, say, perhaps some of the other speakers' positions, that I think there's a good safety net in the forgiveness thing that we need to really lean into. And the fact that many people who weren't kind of keen on Charlie have been able to go, wow, how did she do that?
Yeah.
I think that's a seismic event as well. Her response to it has been huge.
Massive. Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up, because that is countercultural in the sense of everyone anticipating something and then just talk about the gospel message. Like, how does someone do that without Jesus? How do you...
Exactly. Yeah. Well, I say that to, I did a talk on forgiveness, and Tim Keller's last book on forgiveness is called Forgive, How Can I and Why Should I? And I think that's important, two important questions. And the whole issue of forgiveness, when Paul's writing to the early church and says, forgive one another as God in Christ has forgiven you, he couldn't say to pagans, forgive one another as you see the rest of the culture forgiving each other, because they didn't. Forgiveness is a Christian virtue. It wasn't a pagan virtue. It wasn't a Greco-Roman virtue. It wasn't even a philosophical virtue in the ancient world. It came from Christianity. And Paul had to reference Jesus to give the church an understanding of forgiveness, because it didn't come from anywhere else. And I think that's critical.
Oh, that's brilliant. I think that's a perfect place to end as well, Steve. Thanks so much for your time and just your willingness to engage in this conversation, because, it's been one of those events, those seismic events, to use your words, that have really rippled across the entire world and have impacted so many lives. So I think to get a gospel perspective and an understanding of what's happening in our culture, in our this time that we're living in, and then also to get an understanding of how we should respond as Christians, or what we should be noticing, is very helpful. So thanks so much, Steve.
Oh, thanks, Caleb. It's been great to be with you and to talk about big things. It does feel like we're upside down people, and you're aptly named podcast, I have to say.
Thanks.